Thanks, John, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure for me to be here and meet you all this afternoon and give you a little bit of background to the work that I've been doing and what it's meant to me and what I hope to bring to Harvard this year as part of the Loeb Fellowship. So this is where I was from, or am from, a small rural farming area 250 kilometres south of Melbourne in Victoria, Australia. I grew up on a dairy farm, but it wasn't long until I escaped that. Sorry, I had to do it. The stereotype is too true. Yes, there were kangaroos on the farm, and yes, I did chase them when I was a child. I didn't inflict any kind of grievous bodily harm onto the native flora of Australia, but I did know those who did. So it's a country that I think a lot of Americans, you know, they watch Discovery Channel, National Geographic Channel, they buy into the stereotype. So I'm here to probably play into that and then pick it apart a little bit. So yes, around Melbourne there's penguins, there's really cute and cuddly koalas and other cute animals. Oh, wrong one, sorry, that's not so cute. And had to do it, sorry, neither's that one. But don't worry, if you do come to Australia, very unlikely you'll encounter any of these. You might meet him though, not anymore. But really, he's probably the most famous export. This is the area I grew up, about 30 kilometres away from this beautiful location. So we're surrounded by natural environment. This place is called the Wilson's Promontory, about 250 kilometres from Melbourne. Australia is about the same size as America, but has 1/10 of the population. I moved to Melbourne about 25 years ago to undertake my university education in architecture at the University of Melbourne. It is a beautiful city. It's developed very fast, and as the presentation goes on, you'll see that my work experience has taken me mostly outside Australia. I'm more familiar with the developing world, parts of Africa, parts of Asia and parts of the Middle East than I really am with Australia. It's actually been 14 years since I really worked in Melbourne. But it also has its challenges in Australia. It isn't just picture postcard perfect, and there's been rapid urbanisation and a lot of challenges about the contestability of the landscape. The mining industry, inequitable development that has arisen by massive influx of wealth into Australia. Some would maybe pejoratively say that half of Australia is being dug up and sold to China, and there's a price to pay for that. There's also the rural communities, Indigenous Australia. Life is not easy, although there's a growing recognition of the plight of Aboriginal Australia and how to move toward a stronger position of reconciliation. So how do I go from that to this? Well, I'll explain. So I finished architecture in 1996 and I worked in a small design firm in Melbourne. There was only 6 of us and they were very happy days and I learned a lot. I learned to work hard and to constantly rewrite what I was doing, and I think that was a really valuable skill. And if that's one word of wisdom I can pass on to architecture students here, it's even if you're at the 11th hour, be prepared to screw it all up and start again if you are not happy with what you're doing. I deviated out of architecture after about 4 years and joined a publishing firm, Lonely Planet. They do a lot of travel guides. I'd been doing a lot of writing and publishing up to that point, so I started working in the Middle East and North Africa unit for that travel guide company. And then I had a growing interest in social issues, specifically around developing countries and the intersection between architecture, human rights, and politics, and what was that intersection. This is 15 years ago and I was still at a point trying to find it. It certainly wasn't part of the academic experience I had had, but it was part of my process of inquiry. I had a good opportunity in 2001, end of 2001, beginning of 2002, to take a voluntary program in Hanoi in Vietnam. So I moved to Vietnam for a year. And from that moment on, my world didn't really turn backward. Soon after that, I moved to East Timor for another year, working on a post-independence recovery and reconstruction program after the secession of East Timor from Indonesia. And then by 2005, after the Asian tsunami, I moved to Sri Lanka on a 6-month project and ended up staying nearly 5 years. And from that time, I joined the UN. I had about 5 years working with the UN, running their architecture and engineering design team based in Colombo in Sri Lanka, but traveling a lot through Africa and the Middle East and parts of Asia. Now I'm with World Vision International. I've taken 1 year off for unpaid leave, and my job there is Shelter Infrastructure and Reconstruction Manager. So I have a global team of architects, engineers and others, and we have around 44,000 staff, projects in 120 or so countries. Not all of them I'm heavily involved in, but I provide guidance at the strategic level globally, and then implementation. I'm part of what's called the Global Rapid Response Team. So we're obliged in our contract to be on the ground within 24 hours of an emergency, if so called to do. So just a brief overview. When I was preparing this slide yesterday of places I worked, I realised that it's been about 20 countries now. And interestingly enough, when I drop the pins, it really is a story of both resilience and climate change in the world. You'll see a lot of the places I've worked are on in Southeast Asia, where there is historically a high incidence of natural disasters, particularly hydrometeorological events. And then, of course, in the Middle East and parts of East Africa, conflict, drought, and other kinds of natural disasters. I wanted to explain a bit about my world, the humanitarian world, and how it intersects with the built environment. All of you would be aware of the growing influx of refugees into Europe in the last few weeks. I mean, you can't miss it. Every newspaper you open, every news broadcast you see on television shows desperate Syrians and people from other Middle Eastern countries crossing on risky boats to Europe. And the data shows it as well. This is only published in June this year. Now there's around nearly 60 million people who are displaced from their homes globally. That's the highest since World War II. So because of that, there's an urgency around humanitarian work. Combined with natural disasters and the growing incidence of natural disasters due to climate change, rapid and unrestrained urbanisation, there is a shift that we are feeling toward responding to this new reality. How does the system work? I'll briefly mention that there is an architecture to the global humanitarian system. You'll see around here the pre-disaster context, going from prevention, mitigation, preparedness, moment disaster strikes, then there's response, recovery, and reconstruction. Now that's just kind of a generic diagram. In real life, it doesn't really work like that. You often jump from this phase to this phase and back again. I've worked for most of the main UN organisations through an implementing partner relationship. I was working for the United Nations Office of Project Services, running their architecture and engineering design team. I had about 35 staff. And we implemented mostly UNHCR projects, WFP projects, UNICEF, and UNICEF projects. And they range from water and sanitation, shelter, health and education, in the immediate disaster response right through to the reconstruction work. So what actually kind of happens during an emergency? I mean, really, disaster strikes, there's a response period. You might go through a transitional phase where you do some temporary shelters that last for 3 or 6 months or maybe longer. The data actually shows that most transitional shelters are occupied for around 7 years, and most people who are in refugee camps rarely leave. The population tends to grow. People don't really go back to a permanent reconstruction moment, although that's what the diagram suggests is the regular process. Apologies for the lack of clarity in this diagram down below, but here you might be able to just see through the colour. The vertical red bar is when disaster strikes. The red line is the emergency phase, ramps up quickly in the first couple of days, goes along for about a month, then it reduces down after about a 3-month period. The blue line indicates recovery activities. So this really shows you how the reconstruction phase ramps up over time as the emergency recovery reduces. So what would I normally do? I'm in charge of the shelter and infrastructure team, but I work in a multi-sector sense. I work with health professionals, water and sanitation, humanitarian protection and others. And at least in the beginning of an emergency, we do mostly shelter. It depends whether people are displaced from their homes or not. Sometimes people are displaced far from their homes into refugee camps, or if it's a domestic displacement, we call it IDP, internally displaced person. We often get involved in repairing clinics, schools, to get the health system and the education system recommencing as soon as possible. Where that can't happen, often we'll build brand new. But of course, a lot of this depends upon how much money is raised. Hence, there is a symbiotic relationship between humanitarian work and the media. The more the media get out there and the more that we work with them, the more money comes in from generous folk like you to do larger reconstruction programs and have more effective responses. So what needs to be done? Well, from my perspective, it's much more than just a roof overhead. You really, really have to work with people. You have to understand their culture, their background, and where they're coming from. This is an image of some consultations I undertook in Somalia. I had a couple of years going back and forth to Somalia after the drought there, doing some emergency work that led through to some recovery and reconstruction. Working with the Sharia courts, working with the Council of Elders, in remote communities, staying with them, understanding their stories and understanding what they needed to be done and how they wanted it to be done. So you don't really just go there and provide services, you work with people, find solutions, and in the end, as they say, the process is much more important than the product. Most of the time, I'm doing simple buildings in logistically complicated environments. I'll go into a bit more depth now. One of the most significant projects I was involved with, and that was the post-tsunami reconstruction. I'd volunteered to go to Jaffna in northern Sri Lanka on a 6-month project, and as mentioned, I stayed nearly 5 years in the north. I was managing the recovery and reconstruction work on a whole series of infrastructure in the north. We worked closely with other agencies, worked with NGOs, worked with government, and at that time too, there was an igniting or reigniting of the civil war that had laid dormant in the previous few years. So what that really meant was my work went from fundamentally development work back to humanitarian work. As the hostilities escalated, there was a mass exodus. Around 300,000 people left their homes within a 10-day period. So we had to respond. We had to build camps, there had to be water, there had to be education facilities for children, and there had to be shelter for people. So we mobilised resources, brought in materials from India, brought in staff from as far and wide as we could, got on the phone, called friends, got people to fly in from Australia, Europe, America, different countries to give me a hand. It was my team that had the dubious task to design what was then the biggest refugee camp in the world. We had 320,000 people in the camp, and suffice to say, without going into too many details, there were egregious human rights violations. Simple structures that satisfied basic human needs for habitation, provision of water and security. We recommenced the reconstruction period once hostilities had ceased, working closely with people, teaching Build Back Better approaches, trying to develop more climate resilient designs and more appropriate construction techniques so that the money we had could be used to its best advantage. Schools, was involved in the building of about 46 schools and thousands of houses. This work leaves you with a lot of great experiences, a lot of memories. Some of them maybe are not what you would expect. No matter where you go in the developing world, I've always found that there's a very unhealthy respect for occupational health and safety. So you'll find a lot of dubious construction techniques and other things that you wouldn't normally sanction. Really unsafe means of transport. But you find lifelong friends and you build a team of people who come with you from country to country and support you in the process. As I was preparing this morning, there was a couple of words that I wanted to read out that I wanted to make sure that I had the detail correct. So excuse me for reading, but I just wanted to add this detail. I think it's important to interrogate the status quo of what architecture is, of what architects do, and how they're educated. It is clear for me that architects have a role in the world that links design, construction, and materials to fundamental issues of habitation and existence, helping those in crisis through the skills of bringing stakeholders together to produce a project that meets the needs of the most vulnerable after disaster and after conflict. For me, this presentation is a great opportunity to take stock and think about the work I've done over the last 14 years. Some of the main observations that sprang to mind this morning are: architects and designers are educated with a balance of art and science, with the ability to create and act as agents of change, to bring a group of people together to undertake a project. In the humanitarian sense, this can be critical shelter, water, health and education projects. There's a world of need out there and designers are in a great position to respond. There's a lot of professionals working in international agencies, but most of those I met within my 5 years with the UN are working in policy or human rights. There's a gap designers can fill to act as enablers and facilitators, to bring disparate stakeholders together to produce a product. That's a unique skill that we all have, that those educated in different disciplines probably don't have to the same degree. Working in other cultures in extreme conditions brings you closer to people and yourself. And in the end, your technical skills are not enough. You need to give humanism to the work to do it properly, because you're dealing with poverty. And poverty is mostly caused by power imbalances. You will come up against situations such as working in a civil war, where you can witness brutality the likes of which doesn't often exist at home. And in the end, you realise that there is a shared humanity. The built environment is an entry point. And people want their lives improved, and you can help in that process. Lifelong friendships have resulted from this work, and even now, a decade later, I often receive calls from this same group of people, my cohort. They nostalgically still refer to me as Mr. Brett. Many of them have found refugee status in America, in Australia, in Europe, in Switzerland. Often they'll text me. They did last week. Mr. Brett, how are you today? Mr. Brett, when are you coming back to Sri Lanka? And my favourite recurring question, Mr. Brett, why are you not married yet? So my Loeb year, and what do I want from this, and what do I want to share? I took this photo, Mark and Sally will know. I was in Nepal after the earthquake, and I basically was 18 hours out of Kathmandu, up in the foothills of the Annapurnas, doing damage assessment in some villages to put together some proposals for funding. I took this photo when I went inside a damaged house, and there was an elderly woman not knowing what to do. Should a house be destroyed or can it be repaired? If so, who is going to provide the resources? I left that, came back to Kathmandu, flew to Boston, we had the orientation, I got back on the plane on the Sunday and went back to this same town again for another 5 weeks. I only finished there in June, packed up my house in Australia and then moved to America. So my Loeb year, what do I want and what do I want to give? Really, first and foremost, to engage staff and students as fully as possible. Help with the debate, expand the discussion, and assist the learning process. I'll be affiliated with the Risk and Resilience stream, but I'm very happy to be involved in any way that any of you see in your mind at the moment. I'm going to be taking a close look at urbanisation in the US from the perspective of civil society, government and the private sector, and how those three particular pillars interrelate in the urbanisation process. Re-examine those same three in the post-disaster moment by looking at Sandy and Katrina and seeing what lessons can be drawn from the American experience that I can then translate to my humanitarian work. I'll be supporting and want to support professional pathways. This is one thing that I've been making sense of in Australia in the last couple of years. I've been associated with RMIT University in Melbourne, teaching ad hoc and running a course called Pathways into the Humanitarian Sector for Built Environment Professionals. We've been able to use it as an outreach program to registered architects, and they can get professional development credit points. So we run that course twice a year. So I like being able to bring together the profession, academia, and field practice. And I think that's one of my strengths. I'd like to share that. J-term as well. Arif's presentation is next. Our paths haven't actually crossed in the past, although thematically we've been doing a lot of similar work. We've discussed some J-term classes. It could be around humanitarian work, management of humanitarian projects, refugee camp planning, and implementation of projects within the humanitarian setting, or a variety of other things. But I encourage you all, as John has said, to approach me. Feel free to come and talk to me whenever you see me, and I'll do my best to work with you in whatever way you see fit. So thanks, everyone.